Find the answers to questions you may or may not have asked yourself here at Kaleidoscience, Conversations on Cognitive Science, hosted by Elisa Palmer and Sönke Löw. Today's episode is quite special to me. We have the supervisor of my bachelor's thesis as our guest on this podcast. I've done my bachelor's thesis on a special aspect of communication between mother and infant chimpanzees. And, well, today's guest is Bas van Boekholt. He is doing his PhD dissertation on the phenomenon of turn-taking in wild chimpanzees, which, well, I think most people won't have heard of the term turn-taking, so we're going to talk about what that is in a bit. Welcome, Bas, and I'm really glad you're here today.
Thank you for inviting me over.
And at the beginning of each episode, we like to play a little welcome game, and we like you to finish those sentences for us. And the first sentence would be, as a kid, I always wanted to be.
A monkeyologist is the answer to that. Yeah.
That's really cool. So you stuck with it, yeah?
Yeah.
And the second sentence is, if I was an emoji, I would be.
I think it feels too easy to say the monkey emoji.
Which one? Maybe.
I think just like the standard face of the monkey with the smile.
Okay.
Yeah.
My favorite thing to do on a day off is
Sports, I think, like running, but also generally being outside.
That's cool. Right now, I'm most fascinated by.
That's a good question. I think right now I'm most fascinated by. Honestly, I'm shooting a blank here. I think some recent developments. I went to a conference with my field about primatology, and I had some talks that I'm still processing in my head that have an influence on my PhD. But to explain that would take quite a long time to say why I'm fascinated by it. Yeah.
Okay, so it's your research basically.
Yeah. At the
your
moment,
research.
yes. Yeah.
I know it's time to call it a day when.
When I'm literally falling asleep behind my desk, which does happen sometimes.
Okay.
I feel like that's a struggle many PhDs have.
Yeah. When even the coffee can't save you.
Yeah, and then you know it's over.
Yeah.
That was it for the welcome game, and now we want to quickly talk about your scientific background. If I'm correct, you did not do your master's or bachelor's here in Osnabrück, so
No, I didn't.
where did you study and how did you end up here, maybe?
So I think we can go back to that first sentence. Like I was one of those lucky people who always knew what they wanted to be. When I was like a little kid, I said I wanted to be a monkeyologist. I wanted to study primates in general. So I did my bachelor's in biology in Groningen. Maybe it's good to say I'm from the Netherlands. I'm not originally German. So I went to Groningen to do my biology bachelor, and then when I finished my bachelor's, I thought by myself, like I've always said my whole life, I want to be a monkeyologist, which is a non-existing term. But I've never done it, so I never really knew if I really wanted to do it. So I took a gap year, and I went to Malaysia for 6 months to volunteer at a primate research project, Macaca Nimestrina project. And I loved it. I loved being in the jungle, following some pig-tailed macaques around. So when I came back from my gap year, I really knew I wanted to do that. So then I started looking for a master that went in that direction. And then I went to Utrecht, also in the Netherlands, to do a master in behavioral ecology. I did a lot of research there. I did a project on long-tailed macaques, looking at reconciliation and reciprocity. And I also went again for 8 months to South Africa to study alarm calls in vervet monkeys. So I already got a little bit into communication there. And at the end of my master's, I knew I wanted to keep continuing in my quest to become the world's first monkeyologist. So I started looking for a PhD. And I think it's the second or third position that I saw and that I responded to was with Simone Pica's lab here in Osnabrück. And I was lucky enough to get this position when I applied for it. So that's basically how I came here about 3.5 years ago. In March 2020 is when I started my PhD.
Nice.
It nearly sounds like a perfect story. When you look at it from the outside, it sounds like really straightforward.
Yeah, but like I said, I think I'm really lucky with knowing what I wanted. So
Yeah.
like always, I've been having this goal in my mind and being able to focus on how to achieve that goal and how to actually get there. And I remember when I needed to choose my study before my bachelor's, I was like, oh, biology sounds cool, but also I was a little bit into medicine. And then my older sister said to me, well, if you really want to be a monkeyologist, you need to do biology. And then like, I think that from that moment, I was like, okay, yes,
Yeah.
for now, I want to be a monkeyologist, so I really should just focus on choosing everything that leads towards that goal.
Yeah. You just mentioned your PhD position. So
Yeah.
can you maybe shortly explain or say what you're currently doing and what your topic of your PhD is?
Yes. You mentioned already in introduction, I'm looking at turn taking, but I think that was the original conception of the PhD, but the PhD is not static, it develops over time. So I think I'm now a little bit more general looking at the development of communication in chimpanzees, including with a big focus on turn taking, and I'm sure we're going to get to that eventually. But in my PhD, I really look at chimpanzee infants between 0 and 5 years old in the wild. So I've been to Uganda twice in my PhD to collect data on chimpanzee infants. And what I've been basically doing is I'm filming a lot of interactions between the infant and other individuals of the community, which is 60-70% is their mother. So they will interact with their mother a lot. And I think because of the time pressure, I won't be able to analyze everything I have. So I will focus just on mother-infant interactions and really try to see how from like very young, from 0, 6 months, up to 5 years, how their communication develops, how they start using gestures, vocalizations, but also how the interactional structure of those interactions, in which turn taking comes back, changes over development, and to see, always have a comparative outlook to really see, okay, is this comparable with what we know in human infants? Does this development seems the same, or are there differences? With the idea of like, if it's very similar, then maybe those building blocks were already present in our last common ancestor, so that these specific building blocks I'm looking at might be evolutionary before the evolution of human language.
Yeah. You just mentioned vocalizations and gestures. So I think most people don't really have an idea of how chimpanzees communicate, I guess, because when I think of movies, I would normally you would see maybe chimpanzee, or I think there was one show, My Friend Chimpanzee Charlie or something like that.
I don't know.
It's quite old actually. To me it appears quite old, where a chimpanzee called Charlie lived in a human family. But that's not normal for chimpanzees. They don't live in human families, understand human language. They have their own ways of communicating. So how do they do that?
So it's actually, we say we don't really know, but once you get to know a chimpanzee, it's not that different from humans. Of course, it's not human language. I think there's a lot of things where humans and primates, there is more of a gradient evolutionary, but like we really specifically look at human language, there's nothing as complex and as rich and big in the animal kingdom. But there's different facets of human language that we do find across the animal kingdom. But I think when chimpanzees communicate, it's less like human language is always based on speech. That's the main thing, except if you're talking about sign language. But also human language is inherently multimodal, meaning we use speech, but we also use glances, we use our gaze, we make gestures as well. Even our body orientation all helps in support to speech, but also guides can guide whole interactions if you're talking about for example, dancing or giving a hug or a handshake. There's no speech involved there, but still all these other parts come in place. And I think these other parts are more important in chimp language or chimp communication as well. It's a lot more done through body orientation, gestures, which are fairly similar to humans as well. If a chimp wants some food from another chimp, he will stretch out his hand, palm up, as a begging gesture. We all recognize those as begging gestures, and these seem to have the same meaning in chimps as well. So there's a lot of things that are very natural to us and that we recognize that seem to be almost identical in chimps as well. Yeah, and they do use vocalization as well, but not on the same level as we. But it's mainly done through, more like bodily actions.
Have you have you focused on the differentiation between language and communication, because you use like both terms very carefully? Is there like maybe one definition that you have for your thesis?
Yeah. So the thing with like human language, because I have zero background in linguistics, so I really feel like a fish out of the water when I'm talking about language. So I always try to be careful to not step on any toes saying, oh, chimps have language. So like I use more communication as the more general term, as like talking about sending signals, sending and receiving signals, transferring information from one individual to the other. I generally use communication as a thing, and then so all the evolution of human language. But because I don't know enough about language itself, and it has been quite a touchy subject in history as well in our field. I think no scientist would say that other animals have language, because language is such a loaded term and such many different facets to it. And I feel like some theories also, or some like disagreements in our field, are because there is no specific all-encompassing definition of what language is. So maybe people are talking next to each other, and because they are using different definitions, they disagree, even though they might agree on a basic level. So yeah, like the word language is very loaded, and I try not to use it. So really just talk about communication in general.
When I did the research for my thesis, I remember that, especially about chimpanzee, but also great ape communication, I read quite a lot about the first approaches of researching on the communication ways great apes have. For example, it was, people tried to teach them spoken language, which did not work out. Then they tried to teach great apes sign language, which worked out in a way. When we think about the process of great ape communication research, how would you say has it developed over time, and where would you say are we right now?
It has quite a long development path. And I think if you talk about communication studies, generally when you talk about anything related to comparative and to evolution, you have to start with Charles Darwin. He wrote a book called On the Expressions in Animal or Man and Animal, I think. Don't quote me on that, something like that. In which he already showed that there is like these facial expressions, these basic facial expressions like disgust or anger or smiling when you're happy, that we see across cultures in humans, but we also see similar expressions in animals as well. And he was very cautious, not saying, oh, these are the same, but you just see the similarities. So there's always been like this idea of there's some kind of continuity going on. But then about the same year as he published that book, there was the French Society of Linguistics who actually put a ban on studying the origin of human language, because they said, this is a question we can't answer, so we're not going to bother, and nobody is allowed to publish about it. And that set the field back quite a lot. And I think about like a decade later is when we really started looking in it again. And indeed, the first approach was teaching primates human language. So there is this very famous example of Vicky, who was a chimpanzee who lived with his researchers for 3 years, having a lot of speech therapy, a lot of operant conditioning, and after 3 years of really intensive training, he was able to produce 4 words, papa, mama, cup, and up. And I think even with cup, they had to actually put his mouth in a certain way for him to produce that. So that already quickly was like, okay, primates are not able to produce human language. But then they went into gesture, and then there was a little bit more success. There's Coco, there's this chimpanzee called Nim Chimpsky, after Noam Chomsky. And they were teaching sign language, and I think they got to 100 or even to 1,000 words, and even showing a little bit of rudimentary grammar in that. But still, the problem with these approaches, even if you're able to have a chimp or Coco as a gorilla produce human sign language, it doesn't teach you anything about the evolution of our language at all. So then they tended to focus more on, okay, but what does animal communication look like? How does that work? And are there certain building blocks that we see in our language and in animal communication that might have this longer evolutionary history? And because human language is mostly associated with speech, they first started to focus on vocalizations. And this is interesting that when you compare great apes, so chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, to monkeys who are more distantly related to us, we see more rich vocalization structures in certain monkey species than in great apes. And one very important paper, one very seminal work was done by Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney on the alarm call system of furfur monkeys, which I also have a little bit of background with. And these furfur monkeys, they have 3 different alarm calls that they use for different predators. So they have an eagle alarm call for any aerial predators, they have a snake alarm call for snakes, and a leopard alarm call for leopards, but also for jackals, for like large terrestrial predators. And what they showed in this experiments that these calls really seem to have also the meaning of, hey, there is this predator coming. And they showed that doing a playback experiment. So they recorded these alarm calls, and then they would play them back when there was no predator present. They would play, for example, a leopard alarm call, and what they saw is that when the monkeys heard the leopard alarm call, they would react as if there were leopards, so they would climb into the tree, get away from the ground, whereas if they heard an eagle alarm call, they would get down from the trees on the ground, and that's their normal anti-predator response to those alarm calls. So that's the first work, or like the most famous work, where they showed like, okay, some of these calls seem to be like words, like they really seem to have meaning, and they're able to refer to something that's outside there. It's not just like, oh, I'm calling because I'm angry, I have this lot of just an automatic response, but I'm really referring to something that's not about my inner emotions or my inner workings. So that was very promising, but then the problem is that primates don't show any or very little vocal learning. So like we humans, we're able to learn new words, we're able to produce new sounds that we never have heard before quite flexibly. And if you get a furfur monkey from Ethiopia and compare with a furfur monkey from South Africa, their alarm calls are going to be exactly the same. Or almost very similar. So it seems almost that their vocalizations are very innate. They are genetically hardwired. They're not socially learned, even though their usage seems to have some learning processes. So a baby furfur monkey would make an eagle alarm call also to a goose flying over or to a falling leaf. It would still be related to the air, but as it grows up, it will learn that, okay, only when that specific type of hawk or a specific type of raptor comes over, that's when I need to make an illegal alarm call. But they're not able to produce new sounds, like we saw with the chimps as well. It's very, very limited, and their vocal repertoire is quite limited as well. I think it's like maybe in the order, the biggest vocal repertoire in primates is maybe in the order of 20 to 30 calls, and it's already very gradient to us, whereas we humans, because we can recombine and we can work it all together, we have a limitless repertoire. But of course, next to vocalizations, they also started focusing on gestures, and then here we see that great apes seems to produce way more gestures and also use them way more flexibly compared to monkeys, whereas the same gesture can be used in different contexts, but also in the same context, they would use different gestures getting the same goal. So they seem to be able to flexibly choose which gesture produce when to achieve a certain goal. And I think that's quite fairly recent. I think we're now talking about like 10 years ago when really they started really focusing on the gestural repertoire, really saying, okay, maybe this is more interesting. And was shortly a debate about, okay, did human language evolve from vocalizations or did it evolve from gestures? And that debate hasn't been solved. And I personally think it might not be that interesting to solve. the most recent look at it is like, well, language is not just vocalization and gestures. It's inherently multimodal. We're always using these different channels together. We're always combining them together. Even though we use speech a lot, we're always making like it's so important for us to look at the other, to make gestures, to have this body orientation. So the question of in which modality the language evolve is not really that promising. There's not might not be an answer. Might just be all at the same time. And I think that's the most recent development. And then what I'm looking at, I mean, this is still focused on like what type of signals are there, what do they mean, and then what I focus on is the hypothesis of Levinson called the interaction engine hypothesis, which states that, okay, independent of like what's the structure of human language, what does human language exist of, we humans are able to interact with each other. We have these social interactions, and these interactions themselves, they have a certain structure, they have a certain cognitive mechanism behind it. And he says that we humans were already able to socially interact with each other before human language was there. And because we were able to socially interact with each other, language could evolve in the first place. And for us to be able to socially interact with each other, we need this certain set of skills. And then he calls this set of skills the interaction engine. And that sounds very vague, but to give an example, he says, for example, pro-social motivation is part of the interaction engine. Like when we try to communicate, we try to be inherently cooperative. We're not trying to outsmart each other. We really try to get our message across. And the other one knows that, and is also knowing that the other one is cooperative. They knows what he says is probably true, or like there is a reason behind it why he says that. So that's one example. Another example is this face-to-face multimodal part of the interaction that's already inherently is to us. And what we see is that across human languages, across sign language as well, this basic structure of how people are interacting with each other on like the conversational level, that seems to be universal, and that might have like longer evolutionary background. And those building blocks are the one that I look at in my PhD. Like turn taking is one as well. He says like, well, in human conversations, we tend to take turns, not like with this podcast where it's one person talking for a long time and the other one just listening, but we tend to take these turns alternating. And this seems very logical. It seems like, okay, why is that a big deal? But if you really start to think about it and really start to look at it, it's quite special, actually. It's the fact that we're able to communicate with each other, having barely any overlap, but also having these small gaps between turns, where like the average gap in one experiment was about 200 milliseconds, which is very short. Especially if you realize that for our brain to start producing a word, it takes about 600 milliseconds. So for some reason, we're able to predict when somebody's finished talking, and we're already starting to produce our response before he finished talking to get this tight gap. And that's also one of the reasons that if you're having a Zoom conversation, why that is so hard to communicate, because there's a slight little lag on the line, because it's online. And our brain just can't process that, like, because we're so tightly coordinating with each other on a normal day-to-day basis. If there's a little bit lag in the system, suddenly we're struggling and having just a basic conversation online. So like that's one of the reasons why like Zooming is so hard.
I think talking on the phone is even harder, because on Zoom at least you see the other person's face.
Yeah.
When just talking on the phone, you just hear the voice and just have the voice input as information.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think that that's the most recent state of the field where I'm involved. Communication, evolution of language is so big that I don't look at all the different parts. Yesterday I saw a seminar that looked at the relation between the rhythm, like people able to produce music or recognizing rhythm and vocal learning, and they were looking at seals. It was very interesting that seals have this kind of rhythm and they're able to also vocal learning, which is very rare in mammals. In birds it's very common, but in mammals it's just bats and seals and maybe some whales as well that show vocal learning. So that's another part of the field that's very recent, but like, yeah, the field like where I'm involved in is, I think, this idea of like, instead of just looking, okay, what's the structure of the communication itself, we're more looking at a bit how do they use communication? How do they really converse with each other? And what's the structure of their conversations, their interactions with each other?
You just mentioned that quite at the beginning, that humans have a quite large range of sounds they can use for words, but especially great apes mainly use gestures. Is it known how many gestures are commonly used in one species, or is it depending on where they live, how they interact with others? Also, when they are able to learn gestures from human beings, can they expand their own gesture repertoire, or is it always fixed?
To answer that last part first, yes, at least chimpanzees and I think most great apes are able to learn gestures. For example, a very common gesture that we don't see in the wild is pointing, which is very common for humans, but the only times that we see spontaneously chimpanzees or great apes use pointing gestures was in this captive situation, and they were probably learned it from the caretakers. But even apart from that, like even we've seen a captive experience where they are able to learn new kinds of gestures. And the thing is with this gestural repertoire, how big is it? How many? It really depends on how do you classify what a gesture is in the first place, but also when is something the same, just different variations of the same gesture, or when are these different gestures? Because that in the end is arbitrary. Like when you say, if I stretch my arm out with my palm up, is that a different gesture if I stretch my arm out with my palm down? If I also make a little movement with it, like there's like a million ways in which you can really classify gestures, classify movements as different gestures, so that you can make the repertoire as big as you think yourself. So one way to another then look at it, okay, but if there's this different variation, but they always get the same response, or they generally get the same response, then they belong to the same gesture, we say. So like we're more looking at what is the function of a movement, like what's the behavioral response it gets generally, than the actual shape of the thing, because that is arbitrary, where you cut off and make different forms. And what we see, and this is quite recent. So like these are not definitely not known answers that we're 100% sure of, but we see there's a big overlap in the gestures between different chimpanzee communities, but also between different species. So there's this really interesting research where they had this gestural repertoire in chimpanzees, and then they used the same methods, but looked at bonobos, and they saw like 90% of the gestures, I think somewhere between 80 and 90% of the gestures, they both used, and there were only a few gestures that were only seen in bonobos or only seen in chimpanzees. And they included, okay, what's the meaning of gesture, like what's the behavioral response? And even then they saw like, oh, almost every time when a gesture is used in both communities, it has the same meaning in the same context. So this almost seems like, oh, maybe there is some inherent gestural repertoire that is older as well, that we humans have, that we bonobos have, that chimps have. They are currently extending it to orangutans and gorillas as well. I think it is already published, and like there seems to be even like still, it's less, it's not 80, 90%, I think more like 60, 70%. But that's still quite a lot. I think there's like a million ways you can move your bodies, but for some reason we have got this set of movements that have a certain meaning that we see in almost every great ape species there. And is that because they were the most logical in the situation and just make sense, or is that because they are genetically fixed, or because they learned that was something we don't know yet. But it is interesting to see that there is this big overlap in the different gestures that they use, including also the meaning of those gestures.
Yeah. You just, at the beginning, you mentioned as a begging gesture, pulling, or when you beg for food, that you reach out your hand. Humans would also do that in a way in certain situations. Are there other gestures that are known or similar in humans compared to great apes, or is it only this begging that comes to mind?
I think begging is definitely the most clear to see, because it's quite an obvious gesture, and then you usually extend it, but there's a lot of things you can see when I'm following the infants through the forest. If they are suddenly scared for something, they run to their mother and hug their mother, which is something that seems also very human as well. Or if they are climbing up a tree and the mother thinks, okay, they're getting too far away, the mother would just stretch their arm and grab the infant and not like just pull them in and the infant has no choice, and it would just almost just like go around the infant like, hey, you are too far, and then the infant would let go and then they would come back. So there are these small gestures, these small gestures that definitely seem very human as well. There's also, which is something that we humans don't do, but if we would do it, then we would probably do it in the same way, like this grooming behavior that they show a lot. And one very common gesture is that you got one chimp approaching the other chimp, and it would like lift its arm and start scratching at a very spot, very clearly, loudly scratching. And he's signaling there like, hey, I would like you to groom me there, which often happens as well. Where I think, well, maybe in humans we have something similar. If you have a bump on your back or something, or you need someone to look at some place where you can't reach it, then you would also go to that person, like turn your back towards the person and like point at it, like, hey, can you have a look here, or can you apply sunscreen there because I can't reach it.
Yeah.
So there's definitely, I think most gestures are very similar. There's no gesture where I think of like, oh, this is a very weird gesture that doesn't make sense to me, but makes sense to chimps. I mean, there's just situations that chimps have that we humans don't have.
Yeah, true. It's just thinking if we would start sitting all in a circle and groom each other as human beings, I think most people would consider that a bit weird.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think we can now turn our attention to turn taking more specifically. So why is turn taking so fundamental? And maybe, I mean, you shortly explained it earlier, but maybe can you give an example of what turn taking looks like in humans and why it's also found in chimpanzees, or why it's essential to communication?
Yeah, so I think turn-taking, easy to explain, is any kind of conversation you have is somebody taking turns and the other thing. But even it's more than that. It's not just like, okay, we're taking turns talking to each other, but even when somebody is talking and you nod your head at a certain time, or you say at a certain times, those are specific times. Those are not like randomly, and I think those are what they call, I think, like potential turn changing things. These are moments where you could take the turn, but you don't. But you give this confirmation, hey, I'm still there. And every time when I'm talking about this and somebody's nodding and I'm saying, oh, but we have nods, you see them, oh, then you see them being aware of that. So it's very fundamental and we're not aware of it. But it's a very important structure, because the big downside of having speech is when you start overlapping, you can't hear that well what the other is saying. So overlap is detrimental for having efficient communication. So it's important to not overlap, but also not have long breaks in it. So the most efficient way is, in fact, that turn-taking structure. And we can break this turn-taking structure. It's not just about like one turn, the other turn. It's also the way we organize it. We use the way we end our sentences is in certain ways. Also, we make a rise or a downfall in our pitch that we know this is an end of a sentence. We tend to look at the other person when we end a sentence, or look away when we want to keep on talking. So there's this more than just what we hear. There's a lot of body language going on as well, and something we call framework establishment, which is actually something that Elisa looked at in her bachelor thesis, is when we start a conversation or when we have a conversation with multiple persons, we need to somehow be able to communicate who is taking the next turn. If it's just two, then it's the other person, and even then there can be a conflict where one wants to keep on talking and the other wants to go in. We all have know that person where you can't get a word in between because they keep on talking. But especially if it's a multi-party interaction, you need this framework statement to say, okay, who is taking the next turn? We use gaze for that a lot, and that's something that we see in chimpanzees as well. That's one of the most clearest things. That's mainly at the start of an interaction. Like, okay, how do you start? How do I make sure I'm now in a conversation with you? How do I start an interaction with you? And then we see that chimpanzees also use gaze and body direction a lot to initiate an interaction. And then with humans, I'm talking more about conversations because that's what we do a lot and that's most clear. But even when I want to give you a handshake or I want to give you a hug, I still need to somehow make clear, hey, I want to now interact with you. And you still need to establish this framework of getting there. So that's something we see as well. And another element of turn taking is related to something called adjacency pairs, which helps us because, like I said, we have this very tight correlation between me ending a sentence and you already giving a response. But in theory, there's a million responses you can give. So how do you know what to actually respond? So because these adjacency pairs where there is, if I say something, in theory you can have a million responses, but only a few make sense. And to clarify that, if I ask a question, it makes sense to give an answer. If I wave at you, it makes sense to wave back. There is this certain tight links where there's a first pair part and a second pair part that are adjacent next to each other. Hello is also an adjacency pair. And we see that in chimps as well, that there are certain gestures or vocalizations and they have a certain response tied to that. And it's not one-on-one. If I do this gesture, you always respond with a gesture, but it's it's more than chance. If I see this gesture, then I see this response. More often than you would expect based on how we see this response in general in their communication. So these are all different parts of turn taking that we see in humans and that we also see in chimps. And then more related to my PhD, in humans, these turn taking structures, they already appear very early in development, even before human infants start using their first words. In their babbling, they already start using their gaze. They already show overlap avoidance. So even before we start speaking, we already have this kind of turn taking in our system. And that's something I want to see if chimps have as well. Do they, when they're really young, just randomly produce gestures and vocalizations, or do they also try to avoid overlap, try to really react to their mother, really gaze and use body direction towards their mother as well? When do we start seeing those adjacency pairs, those links? Do they already know from very early on, if my mother produced this gesture, I have this response? Or do we see that in the beginning, they don't really react, or they react wrongly, or they just don't have this adjacency pair structure yet, but after 2-3 years old, we see that there is certain gestures that have a very specific response.
That makes sense. I was first thinking of turn taking maybe like that it's very functional for overt speech, because as you said, if two people are talking at the same time, you can't understand anything. But then I thought a little bit about it more, and then I realized that maybe it's not just overt speech, but also, I mean, for example, when we play games or something, then we also use like turns to organize the whole thing. So it's not just tied to overt speech, but is something that we do in general if we doing something collaboratively or.
Yeah, exactly. When you start to think about turn taking, you see it everywhere. And it can be very structured, like in certain games where, like in chess, you really take a turn. You can't place the things at the same time, or traffic lights. There's a lot of turn taking in general that's very structured, like a very influenced from outside because of certain rules. But in our conversation, nobody is forcing you to not talk over me. There's no external rules saying that we have to do it this way. It just tends to be the most efficient, and we tend to be very good at it. But there's a lot of turn taking structure in our world in general. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds a bit like it's also basic social rule in a way. So when we wouldn't take turns, we would really badly interact with other people. So in order to act socially, or in order to work functionally in a society, we need to take turns to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Is it the same in apes? So could they also communicate when they wouldn't focus on how the other is responding or not responding? So,
that's very interesting because, the downside of having speeches with overlap is really detrimental. We don't really have that with gestures. I can produce a gesture and you can overlap with my gesture production. I can still see what you're doing, you can see what we're doing, and we won't have that breakdown as much. So in that case, if you just look at gestures, then turn taking doesn't have to be. There's there's some reason for it, but like there's less costs involved if there's no turn taking. But so I kind of lost my train of thought there.
I was asking how far, what's the social trade-off apes get from turn taking? Is anything known about it, or is it just hypotheses right now?
Well, what we do see is that, and this is quite very preliminary, so definitely not definitive yet. But we do see is that we tend to see that individuals that are more socially bonded, that are either they grew more or they're more in the same party, they tend to associate more. They seem to have this tighter relationships in their call and response. So like this temporal gap between their turns seems to be smaller when they're really when they're more socially bonded. So it seems almost like they feel each other better. They're better able to respond to each other related to these social things. And there's also some studies being done about, okay, what's the role of rank? Do you quicker respond to somebody that's really highly ranked because you want to appease them or not? And there's some mixed evidence here. We don't really know. What we do know is that, at least in gorillas, that they are aware of these turn-taking things as well. And the way they did it was in a captive study, is that they used, again, playback experiments. So they had this certain turn-taking call structure that they heard in their community, and then they would alter that in some way. They would either have a very long gap or some overlap, or their normal way they respond, like with a normal temporal gap as they measured in the population. And what they saw is then when they altered things, when they changed things, the gorilla in question, the subject, would look longer at the speaker, as almost saying like this was wrong. It seemed wrong. This turn-taking structure, so they are definitely aware of it as well. They're not just doing it, but they're not aware. We see that in gorillas, and I think there's a study in chimpanzees, but I'm not sure as well. It's very similar, where they are aware of like, okay, when something is wrong, when there is overlap, when there is not. And also, we're not talking about as if they're only doing turn-taking. There are also a lot of overlap, and there's also this idea of a chorus where you actually want overlap, where you want to synchronize as much as well. And chimps have this vocalization called a penthood that I'm not going to do here. This is very loud, very long distance call that they may be using to localize other parts of their community that are not there, because maybe important to know, chimpanzees, they live in these big communities, but they're not as one group always together. There's something called fission fusion dynamics, where like the bigger community would also break down in smaller parties, which can fission further in even smaller parties and then fuse again, and it's very dynamic. So in the community that I studied in Uganda, there's actually two communities. They were like 80 and 120 individuals, whereas at most I saw maybe 50 individuals, and that's very rare. Usually it's a party of like 12 to 20, or sometimes just a mother and the infant. It's very dynamic. So in the big rainforest, they know their community is around, like they have a certain territory, but they could be anywhere, and they sometimes use this bandwidth calls to They seem to use it to see, okay, where is everybody else? And then there's this call and response. But when they're in the same party, it also can be more of like a display of like, look at with how many we are, especially if they're closer to their edge of the territory. It's more like a display of like, look, we are very many. And in that case, you want to synchronize. You want to sync up. You want to have as much overlap as well. And also, because it's not like one single call, it's a very like a certain way to build up. You want to synchronize that as well. And then we also see that more socially bonded individuals are better able to synchronize their penthood to get to that end climactic part of the penthood at the same time, better compared to individuals who are less associated. So we're talking a lot about turn-taking and avoiding overlap, but also when we actually want overlap and want to synchronize, they also seems to be a social thing where friends, for lack of a better word, are better at synchronizing, but also better at turn-taking compared to less associated individuals.
I think it's the same when people talk to another, because when I know, or when I have a good friend, I usually know when he or she is going to finish a sentence and when it's more likely to be my turn to start speaking or to not start speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And also in singing, when you would sing in a human chorus, you would know when it's your turn to start singing in a group and when it's your turn to not sing in a group.
Yeah.
So maybe to make it a bit more onto the human again, so people can grasp it a bit more easily. It's maybe a bit like that as well, or would you say it's still different?
No, I think that's very, very similar. And I think it really relates to the expression "very good friends." They finish each other's sentences because you know each other that well. Communication is way simpler actually there. But yeah, the amazing part is that even with total strangers, we are able to have a conversation with somebody we never met, even if they speak another language. We would struggle, but like the turn-taking structure would be there. And I think we see that in chimps as well. But that's something we try hard to study because we could never just get a chimp, remove it from its place and place it into a cage with another chimp that I've never seen before. That would go horribly wrong and also ethically not done. Mm-hmm. So we're not really able to test that, but we do see that, like, if they're within a community, there are individuals who are very closely together, and we need just individuals who are in the same community, but they don't interact that often. And we see differences, but we do see that basic turn-taking structure, at least elements that we test for, seems to be there also with less bonded individuals.
Yeah. You just mentioned a bit earlier that the group you were focusing on in Uganda was quite special during your recordings because they were quite large as a group. Yeah. Are there any other, do you have any in-field experiences you can share, or any anecdotes which you enjoy thinking about or which are really...
So many. Maybe, so I went to the Ngogo community in Uganda, in Kibale National Park. For people listening, if it sounds interesting, there has been a Netflix documentary called Chimp Empire.
I've actually watched that one.
It's about a year ago released, and it was also filmed when I was there, which I think is really cool because when you go to the field, you get all this experience and you can tell them to your friends, but they will never be able to experience what you experience. But now I actually can show, these are actually the chimps I looked at as well, and there's an infant in there that I actually, she's part of my data sets, she's very dear to me, very important to me, and I can actually show her to others instead of just my video, but actually with a whole story behind it. So the Ngogo community is quite special to start with as first, because a community of chimpanzees generally is between 50 to maybe 100 individuals. That's I think the largest community that we've known before Ngogo was about 100 individuals. But then when they started studying the Ngogo community about 30 years ago, they quickly realized there were more here. So when they started studying, there was actually one community that is over 200 individuals big. So it was twice as big as the biggest that we've ever seen before. But about 6-7 years ago, they started to become a split in between the communities, and they started to fission apart in a western part and a central east part, which is, again, it was very unique. The only other case, we know this happens, we know they grow, they fission, they sometimes fuse, but we're actually be able to study that only once, which was in Gombe, where Jane Goodall did her research. When they just started to habituate, when they just started to be able to collect data on it, they saw that it was also fission. But it was just in the beginning, they didn't really know what they're looking at. So this is the first time we're actually able to see, what happens if a huge community splits and what happens. And it's at some point also very tragic because you see that chimps who used to be friends, who used to hang out together, then suddenly when they see each other, they actually fight and they have this big confrontations that can also be lethal, and there have been chimps killed between those communities. And once spoke to us, there's something you see in that as well in Chimp Empire. So it's a very unique community as well. And because it's so big, I was lucky enough that there were also lots and lots of infants. And you can imagine we don't have trackers on those chimps. We don't really know where they are in the morning. And so in the morning we go out. We know which trees are in fruit. We tend to go in that way. We know where we left them yesterday, which way they were moving, at least that party when you're there. But it's a small part of the bigger community. But sometimes you just have to be lucky, and sometimes you have to listen. And there have been days where I've been walking for 8-9 hours, and I didn't see a single chimp. Just those days are there as well. But yeah, when you're with chimps, it's very cool, and I'm lucky enough to focus on the infants. So I've got lots and lots of cute infants moments, infants playing with their mother, infants playing with each other. Do I know any specific anecdotes?
Maybe a quick question: how close are you to those individuals, and do they react to you? How does that look?
Yeah, no, that's good to explain. So with any chimp research being done in the field, it takes a long time. So first time when you arrive there, you won't see any chimps. They will run away before you even get there. It takes about 10 years for a chimp community to get used enough to researchers to kind of ignore them, and it's called habituation. So I was lucky enough, and Go was already almost 30 years old now. So by the time I was there, they were completely habituated to researchers. They tend to ignore us. Still, we are wearing masks, and we go in quarantine before we go to the field. So when I arrived there, first I'm 8 days in a quarantine camp, and then I go to the actual camp in the middle of the jungle, because there's a lot of diseases that chimps can get for us as well. And for us, it might be a harmless flu. For them, it can be deadly. And the biggest example is COVID. I went there during the corona crisis. So, of course, we had to be extremely careful that we don't give COVID to the chimps, because we can tell humans to keep 1.5 meter distance, to wear masks. We can't tell chimps to do that. So you can really imagine if one chimp gets something deadly, it can spread through the community very quickly. So even in the field, we would always wear masks. And we keep a distance of minimal 7 meters. Like we tend to go towards 10 meters, but sometimes you get a little bit closer. But generally, when a chimp would move towards you, you move away, you move out of the way, you keep your distance. With only 2 exceptions is when a male chimp, sometimes they have this displays, they start running around, they start throwing logs, they start shaking things to show off how big they are and to get this dominance, and they might also do that towards you. The last thing we want to know is that the chimps know that we are scared of them, for example. So when a male chimp comes rushing towards you, you actually need to stand your ground, you need to look at your notebook or look up as if you are bored, as if you totally don't care, which can be tricky at some points, but they would also always veer off. They would like maybe 1 or 2 meters away from you, they would like go to the left or go to the right. They would, and I have to say, rarely hit you, because they would never hit you fully, but like once, and this happened with me, there was this chimp who coming towards me, it's called Jackson, and he veered off like a meter before me, but he grabbed the sapling to like just shake it, and he hit my backpack with that sapling. And I've heard of other stories where they brushed against the researcher, they would touch the researcher, but that happens rarely. But yeah, then you need to stand your ground. And the other exception is, which I have more, is with juveniles and infants who want to play with you. And if they notice, okay, if I move towards him, then he moves away, then they can see that as a little game. And we don't want that either, that they really see this as a game, because then they would constantly walk towards you, you move away, and then you're interacting with the chimp. And generally, you want them to be there and to ignore you. So yeah, you keep your distance while still trying to film them, and you notice just like with humans, there's different personalities. Some chimps really don't care. There's this one chimp called Rich Burgle, who usually he really don't care about humans a lot. So he would walk straight past you, so you would always have to move away from him because he just doesn't care that you're there. Whereas others, they would also always walk around you. They would always make a wide turn around you, but he doesn't care. And there's been several times where I'm filming a chimp, and then he would be behind me, and I wouldn't know, and he would just like literally brush past me within like a few centimeters, or sometimes, and once he even like just touched me, but not like, oh, I want to touch him. He's just like, I want to take this path, and you're standing in the way, so I'm just gonna move this way. Which of course is something we try to avoid. But yeah, you don't have eyes in the back of your head, so sometimes you don't see it. Yeah, so now we always try to keep our distance of 7 meters, but sometimes that just doesn't work, and the chimps decide. And with me following mothers, some mother, again, different personalities. Some mothers don't care at all. Some mothers can get a bit anxious. Some mothers are very annoying in the morning, but once you follow them for 2-3 hours, they kind of tend to give up. They're like, okay, I know today you're following me, and they get less shy about it, and they just do their own business. Whereas those mothers, as soon as they almost have to play this game where you're like not really following them, but then you are following them, but like the moment they look at you, you look away as if you're, oh, I'm just here, I'm not following your infant now, I'm just happen to be here. Because as soon as they notice, okay, you're really following me, then they start to run away, or then they start to climb up the tree, and like if a chimp really runs away, you can do what you want, you can follow them for maybe 20, 30 minutes, but then you will eventually lose them. And there is this one mother called Callas, with her son Kano, and she was really shy, so she was really difficult to follow. So like I tried to get data of of as many infants as possible, once a month. So I really tried to like every month to get like a full day of following one infant, so I could track the development over time. And because you can't decide who you're following, it's just who you happen to find. There's a lot of times where you find 3 mothers and you have to make a decision, okay, who am I gonna follow today? And then you choose mother A, and then in the next 3 days you just find mother A and you don't find mother B and C, where you're like, oh, should I follow B and C? But with Callas, is like she was very tricky to follow, and you wouldn't see her very often. She was also quite shy, but sometimes you happen to see her, and you would follow her. And if she was somewhere and you would arrive, she would look at you, and at that moment she would decide if she was going to be nice that day or not. There was days like even if she was nice, it was tricky. But if you kept your distance, in those cases, I would keep like 15, 20 meters, whereas with other mothers, I would stay 7 meters and they wouldn't care. But I remember this one day, there was like this big group. They were moving in a certain direction very slowly, and I was following Callas. And what she would do is I was on the right in the group, she was on the right group, she would just cross the group to the left side. And because I have to keep my distance of all the chimps, I can't follow her. So I had to go all the way around the group, walking many more meters until I found her again. I kept my distance, and as soon as she saw me, she went to the right side of the group. And she did that 3 times until like the group generally rested, and I did find a spot where she didn't care about me being there, but like I knew 100% sure she knew, like, okay, I can run away, but then he will run after me. The only way I can actually get rid of this annoying human is to cross the group where he can't follow me because he has to keep the distance.
That sounds very smart. At the end of the episode, we always try to put the topic into the context of cognitive science in general. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I would assume that your main focus is somewhat of a linguistic background, because you're focusing a lot on communication, but you said that you don't have a scientific background in studying linguistics. Yeah, so what would you say is the main scientific field or the focus area of your research?
Yeah, like I don't have a linguistic background. I also don't really have a cognitive background. I really come from ecology, from behavior. But what I think is that, yeah, I'm really focused on behavior. So what I'm looking at is what I'm seeing. Whereas cognition, it tends to be, okay, what happens in the brain? What are the mechanisms behind what makes behavior? And I feel like sometimes scientists are interpreting behavior way more than they could be. Like there's just like I tend to say, okay, what I see is what there is, and that's what I make sense of. And I actually try to stay away about, okay, but what's the cognitive mechanism behind it? What's happening in the brain? So I actually tend to stay away from cognition. But still, you can have this yeah, you can. I mean, cognition is what produces behavior. It is the process behind it. And it's very interesting to really focus on, like, okay, what is making this behavior happen? But also it's just as valuable to just look at the behavior itself and see if that makes sense independent of the cognition. Like there is the link to be made, but it doesn't have to be made always. And I feel like sometimes in my field we always have to also talk about cognition in communication a little bit with intentionality, which is something I won't get into. But there's really focus on, like, okay, there has to be an intention behind it, there has to be cognition behind it. And I think that there's definitely a field in that, but there's also the part of the field where it's just like, okay, but look just what's happening and does that make sense in general, independent of what's happening in the brain behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's also also why it's quite tricky to, at least for cognitive science students, to grasp what the comparative biocognition group is working on, because as you've mentioned, we are often focusing quite a lot on the neuroscientific background, which you are not doing.
Yeah.
Or we focus on behaviors and try to understand why they behave in a certain way, but not from the kind of just behavior side, but more what are the mechanisms behind moving them to act in a certain way. But as you were explaining your focus, I was thinking, is it more biology or neurobiology, or is it more psychology for you? Like linguistics, yes, but psychology or biology?
I feel like I'm definitely more a biologist than a psychologist. Yeah, I really come from the animal itself in its environment, and then, okay, what's their behavior, and does that make sense in the environment it is in? So also a bit of ecology in there as well.
Yeah. When you would explain, or when someone would ask you, hey, I've heard you've been in a podcast, what would be the shortest summary you could give about this interview?
About this interview?
Yes.
It was a very nice interview where I was able to ramble on communication in primates and the evolution of human language and my experience in the field. I think about that. Listen to the podcast.
So thank you very much for being here today. Thank you for your time, and good luck with finishing your dissertation.
Yeah, no, again, thank you for inviting me. It was very interesting. This is my first podcast, and I was really happy to be here, and the time went way quicker than I was expecting it to be. Thank you.
Before we roll the credits, we'd like to inform you about the Coxie Space Day. This is an event happening on the 18th of November 2023. On the Coxie Space Day, you can meet us as the makers of the podcast, but also connect to other fellow cognitive science students and alumni. There will be a lot of different booths, fun workshops, and some exciting surprises. The Coxie Space Day will be the perfect spot to get in touch, connect, and find orientation in the whole universe of possibilities in cognitive science. You can register on www.coxiespace.de, that's COGSCISPACE.de. We hope to see you there. When you enjoy listening to us, the best way to support us is by following us on your chosen podcast app. This could either be Google Podcast, Spotify, or Apple Podcast. Another good way to support us is by following our Instagram account, which is called kaleidoscience_pod. On our Instagram account, you will also get regular information on the next episode. Thanks a lot for supporting us. This was Kaleidoscience, hosted by Elisa Palmer and Sönke Löw, produced by Elina Ohnesorge, Elisa Palmer, Sönke Löw, and Sophie Kühne. Produced in collaboration with the Cognitive Science Student Journal. The music was produced by Jan-Luca Schröder. The logo was designed by Annika Richter. Thank you for listening and joining us on our journey through conversations on cognitive science.